Nerd alert! Learning is important, right?
Yes, exactly. What a bunch of nerds.
Nerd alert!
Right.
Marketing Architects.
Hello, and welcome to the Marketing Architects, a research-first podcast dedicated to answering your toughest marketing questions. I'm Elena Jasper on the marketing team here at Marketing Architects, and I'm joined by my co-host, Rob DeMars, the Chief Product Architect of Misfits and Machines.
Hello!
Hello, we're back with your weekly Nerd Alert. Every week, I'll take a deep dive into academic marketing research and translate its complex ideas into simple, understandable language for Rob, and of course for all of you. Are you ready to nerd out, Rob?
I just went shopping at Nerds R Us and the fridge is stocked.
Okay, I'm sorry. I'm like starting to laugh before you even start now when I ask that question. Nerds R Us is never going out of business, hey?
It's never going out of business. Nope.
All right, let's
That's
get into it.
prime retail space right there.
As always, I'm going to link the research we cover in the episode notes. This week I read a study titled When Brands Go Dark, a Replication and Extension. This is by Pei-Ling Pa, Nicole Hartnett, Virginia Beale, Zhang Trin, and Rachel Kennedy, all from the Ehrenberg Bass Institute. But before I get into things, Rob, let me ask you this. What happens when a brand goes dark and turns off their advertising spend?
I think you defer cost and incur brand damage.
Yeah, that's a safe. Yeah, you got it. Episode done. That's the takeaway. Everybody can turn it off. So it's a big question. What happens next? Because let's be honest. Yeah, marketers, we like to say going dark is dangerous. Don't do it. But a lot of us can't actually point to hard numbers. It's usually a mix of gut instinct, maybe a scary case study from the 2000s. But this study gives us some real evidence. And what we're talking about...
meat and potato.
Yeah, sure. It's called When Brands Go Dark, and it's a big deal. It builds on a previous study that made waves when it looked at what happened to alcohol brands in Australia when they stopped advertising for long periods. And this earlier paper found that when brands went dark, sales dropped, and they kept dropping the longer they were silent, which was what you said, Rob. That was just one category in one country. So this new study said, let's go bigger. And these researchers, they looked at 365 US brands from 22 consumer packaged goods categories. We're talking about everything from cereal to carbonated beverages to skincare, pasta, cough drops. And instead of just looking at sales volume, they zoomed in on market share, which is an even more useful metric for long-term brand health. And here's the headline. If you stop advertising, your market share drops, and it drops steadily the longer you stay silent. On average, market share declined by 10% after 1 year, 20% after 2 years, 28% after 3 years, and 30% after 4 years. And what's interesting is that this decline, it's not immediate and catastrophic. It's more like a slow leak. Year one might feel okay. You might even convince yourself that your past brand equity is still doing the heavy lifting. But by year 3, you're really bleeding share. And by year 4, it's not just a decline, it's a warning sign. But it gets more nuanced than this. The researchers, they also looked at which brands specifically suffered the most. So Rob, what factors do you think cause going dark to have the worst effects on a brand?
What factors? I mean, things like if you're in a highly competitive category, obviously those are things like CPG products. That's going to really play into it. Newer brands are obviously going to struggle. They have a job to do in terms of even being known. Things like brand loyalty, or is there other ways of companies to be able to know about you beyond media, like shelf space and things like that? But if you're direct to consumer, you're truly dark if you're not advertising.
Yeah, I think you're right on it. They narrowed it down to 2 big things, brand size and trajectory, before going dark. So to start with brand size, larger brands are more resilient. Probably not super surprising, because if you're well established, you can kind of coast for a little bit. You might even hold on to some of your share for a year or 2 before things started to slip. But smaller brands, they weren't so lucky. Some of them dropped quickly and sharply, especially if they weren't growing before they went dark. But it gets even more tactical. The trajectory of your brand before stopping advertising was the single best predictor of future success or failure. So if your brand was already in a decline, stopping advertising just accelerated the fall. If your brand was stable or growing, you had a little bit of a buffer. But even then, the losses started stacking up over time. And this wasn't some sort of quirky finding. They tested it across a massive range of product categories. And while the exact size of the decline varied, like coffee brands really took a hit, they lost 80% of their share over 3 years. The general pattern held up across almost every category. There were a few exceptions, though. Brands in categories like cat food or baby food didn't decline as much. Some even grew slightly, but those were outliers. In general, the longer you're out of market, the more likely you are to lose relevance. But I thought that's interesting, just like the momentum matters, which makes some sense. The hard part is the brands likely to cut spend are probably brands that are already on a downward trend.
Self-fulfilling prophecy.
But one of the really useful things about this study is they do break down performance further by category type. And they use this framework from the Food Marketing Institute that classifies products into staples, fill-ins, niches, or variety enhancers. So, Rob, what categories of brands do you think suffered more or less than others when they turned off their advertising?
I would think, again, going back to categories that probably suffer more are going to be like your CPG brands or retailers, or even like subscription services where you're really relying on that churn. And then suffering less, I would imagine your bigger monopolies, like you said before, like if you really own a category, or essential services, things like that.
I think you're close there. What they found was low frequency categories suffered a lot more when they stopped advertising for multiple years. So if people aren't buying your product very often and you're not reminding them you exist, you fall out of the mental rotation. So if you're marketing tea, skincare, deodorant, you might want to fight even harder to stay visible than, say, crackers or cereal that you buy every week. But there's a theoretical tie-in here. The study points out that losing market share isn't about losing your core loyalists. It's about losing those light buyers, those who buy your brand once or twice a year. And we know from Ehrenberg-Bass theory that light buyers are the majority of your customer base. But they're also the easiest to lose if your brand disappears from memory. And that's what this whole study really reinforces. Mental availability matters. Advertising isn't just about short-term sales. It's about staying in people's heads so that when the moment of purchase comes, especially for those once-a-year buyers, your brand shows up. And there's a great line in this paper. They quote a media researcher named Erwin Efron who said, "Not being there with a message is like being out of stock." And I love that because that's what happens when you go dark. Maybe your product isn't still on the shelves, but mentally you're out of stock. Your brand's
Right.
shelf in the brain is empty. And what I like about this study is it gives us some actual numbers. You can walk into a meeting and say, here's what could happen if we go dark. Are we prepared to lose 10% share in a year? We could lose 28% by year 3. That kind of data turns marketing into a strategic conversation, not just a cost center. I will say this study expanded it from their first study of just alcohol brands. We are still looking at consumer packaged goods, but it seems like they, based on the study, that I would think we can extrapolate this to other categories too. It would also line up with what we've seen with our own clients when they've paused TV, even in different categories beyond CPG. But that's just our perspective. Really quick, the Rob GPT. Turning off your ads is like turning off the fridge. Everything still looks fine for a bit, but spoilage is coming. I had asked it for another one that I liked. Advertise it as like watering a plant. If you stop for a day, you're fine. If you stop for a year, that thing's dead. All right, what did you think?
It added more data against something that you know is true, but you're not always sure it's true. You know, it's just like exercise or eating going to help you in the long term or not. We think so. The data supports it. And you're like, yeah, okay, it helps confirm longstanding assumptions. So yeah, that was really interesting.
I like the study too because I think a lot of times you hear marketers all the time who turn off advertising and they could feel the effect. Like, oh, last year we were investing more, this year we're not. Like it shows up in the data. It'd be great if we could use more studies like this to make the case before. And I know sometimes there's simply nothing you can do, but it's nice to just have more evidence that you could point to before you have to find out the hard way what happens.
I think adding nuance to the type of category is helpful when you're having those conversations with marketers, because it doesn't seem like some blanket statement of fact. It's, hey, there's a lot of nuance to this. We recognize that, but your particular category, it's either more important or less important, or what do the nuances help tease out?
Yes, exactly. If you're in a low frequency category and your growth is slowing, you really don't want to cut advertising. That's it for this episode of The Marketing Architects. We'd like to thank Taylor De Los Reyes for producing the show. You can connect with us on LinkedIn, and if you like the podcast, please leave us a review. Now go forth and build great marketing.
I like that analogy though, but
Yeah, out of stock.
I just feel like my brain is out of stock a lot, you know, so
Yeah, me too.
Marketing architects.